Hey guys, and welcome back to Born in the Past. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtains and stepping into the most powerful and private rooms of the medieval world, the chambers of the king. We have an image of royalty from this era, one of a life of absolute power, of grand feasts, epic battles, and unquestioned authority. A life of luxury and freedom. But the daily reality of being a king or queen was often far stranger, more ritualized, and deeply less private than you could ever imagine. It was a life governed by bizarre habits, crippling superstitions, and suffocating traditions, where every moment, from waking up to using the privy, was a public performance with deadly political stakes. Tonight we explore the weirdest habits of medieval royalty, and uncover the very real, very human reasons behind them. So before the king holds his court, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the stranger side of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. All right, a hush falls over the chamber. Let's not keep His Majesty waiting. Imagine you are a young nobleman in the court of a powerful king in the 15th century. Your name is Thomas, and after months of petitioning, your father has finally secured you a place at the most exclusive and sought-after event in the entire kingdom, the King's Morning Lever. This is the formal, ritualized ceremony of the king's waking and dressing, and to be invited is a sign of immense favor. You are ushered into the king's bedchamber before the sun has even risen. The air is cool and smells of beeswax candles, old tapestries, and the faint lingering scent of last night's wine. It is not an empty room. Standing silently in the shadows are a dozen other men, the most powerful people in the realm. You see the king's brother, a formidable duke, his face a mask of stone. You see the archbishop, his hands clasped before him. You see the Lord Chancellor and the Master of the Horse. They are not talking. They are waiting, their positions in the room dictated by a strict and invisible hierarchy. This is not a bedroom. It is a stage, and the main actor is still asleep. The centerpiece of the room is the king's bed, a massive four-poster oak structure, surrounded by heavy velvet curtains that are drawn shut, concealing the monarch completely. This is the sacred space, the heart of the kingdom's power. At a precise moment, a high-ranking servant, the lord of the bedchamber, steps forward. He does not shout. He approaches the bed and speaks in a low, respectful tone. "Your Majesty, it is time." There is a stirring from within the curtains, a low groan. The performance is about to begin. The lord of the bedchamber nods to two other high-ranking nobles. It is their great honor for the day to be the ones to pull back the velvet curtains. They do so slowly, revealing the king, propped up on a mountain of pillows, his eyes still heavy with sleep. What you are witnessing is the logic of medieval kingship made manifest. The king was not seen as a private individual. He was the embodiment of the state. His body was a public entity. Therefore, even his most private moments, like waking up, were a matter of public and political ceremony. The lever was a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to reinforce the king's power and the court's hierarchy. A nobleman's status was measured by how close he was allowed to the king's person. The ritual continues. The king swings his legs out of bed. The lord of the bedchamber has the honor of placing the royal slippers on his feet. Another nobleman, a powerful earl, steps forward holding a silver basin, while the archbishop holds a pitcher of scented water for the king to wash his hands and face. As the king dresses, each article of clothing is presented by a different courtier, in a strict order of precedence. The duke, his brother, is granted the ultimate honor of handing the king his clean linen shirt. A lesser baron might be allowed to hand him his breeches or his stockings. You, a young man, watch this from the back of the room, utterly terrified of making a single sound. You are a spectator at a silent, high-stakes ballet. You see the subtle glances between the nobles, the jockeying for position, the quiet satisfaction on the face of the duke, who was chosen to present the shirt, and the flash of jealous anger on the face of a rival who was not. The most important political business of the day is already being conducted. And the king has not yet had his breakfast. You realize that to be invited into this room is a sign of favor, but to be excluded from it is a quiet political execution. It is a signal to the entire court that your influence is waning. Finally, the king is dressed in his basic clothes. The lever is over. The nobles bow and begin to file out of the room, their faces once again impassive masks. The king will now proceed to a more public chamber to finish his dressing and receive his first audiences of the day. You have just witnessed the strange, silent, and deeply political reality of a king's morning, and you understand that in this world, absolute power comes at the cost of absolute privacy. The king, having been assembled by the highest-ranking nobles of the land, is now ready for his first meal of the day. He proceeds to a private dining chamber, a room adorned with rich tapestries, and a heavy oak table already set with silver plates and crystal goblets. But for a monarch in the Middle Ages, the simple act of eating was never a simple pleasure. It was a ritual dominated by a single, all-consuming and entirely rational fear: poison. In an age of brutal political maneuvering, where succession was often decided by a well-timed death, poison was the weapon of choice for the ambitious and the discreet. It was silent, effective, and in a time before forensic science, almost impossible to prove. A king did not just fear assassins with daggers and dark alleys. He feared his brother's ambition, his cousin's jealousy, and even his own wife's political maneuvering. Every cup of wine could be a chalice of treason. Every plate of food a potential instrument of a coup. This constant, gnawing paranoia shaped the entire bizarre ecosystem of the royal kitchen and the dining hall. To combat this invisible threat, a very specific and unenviable job was created: the royal taster. This man, sometimes called a credentarius, was the king's human shield against assassination by diet. His entire function was to risk his life before every single meal. Imagine you hold this position. You stand beside the royal table as dish after magnificent dish is brought from the kitchens. Roasted meats, fine breads, exotic fruits, and pitchers of wine. Before a single morsel touches the royal lips, it must first pass yours. The ritual is one of high tension and public performance. The royal steward presents a dish to you. In full view of the king and the attending courtiers, you must take a small portion onto a separate plate and eat it. Then you take a sip of the wine. And then you wait. You must stand there for a prescribed period, while the king watches you, the court watches you, and you watch yourself, monitoring your own body for the first telltale signs of distress. Is that a cramp in your stomach, or just nerves? Is your head feeling light from fear, or from the first effects of nightshade? Every second is an agony of suspense. Only after you have survived this period of observation, without collapsing in a seizure, is the dish declared safe for the king to eat. You perform this function for every single dish, every single drink, every single day. It is a position of immense trust, but it is a trust built on the premise that your life is expendable and the king's is not. But the taster was just the first line of defense. The fear of poison was so great that it gave rise to a whole host of other, often superstitious protective measures. Monarchs and wealthy nobles would spend fortunes on objects believed to be universal antidotes or poison detectors. Chief among these were bezoars, which were not magical gems, but stony concretions taken from the stomachs of goats and other ruminants. It was believed that a bezoar, when placed in a cup of poisoned wine, would neutralize the threat. Even more valuable were the spiral tusks of narwhals, which were sold throughout Europe as the horns of the mythical unicorn. A unicorn horn was considered the ultimate defense. A king would have a piece of it dipped into his drink or touched to his food, believing it would sweat, change color, or miraculously neutralize any poison present. These horns were worth many times their weight in gold, a testament to the pervasive fear that dominated the royal dinner table. Certain precious stones and even goblets carved from special crystal were also believed to have the power to reveal or resist poison. The entire royal kitchen was a fortress. The ingredients were guarded, the cooks were watched, and the path of the food from the fire to the king's plate was a carefully monitored procession. Every meal was a logistical and security challenge. After you, the taster, have done your nerve-wracking duty, the king finally eats. He dines on fine manchet bread, roasted pheasant, and drinks the best wine from France, all while you stand silently by, your stomach full of small, terrified bites. You have done your job. You have survived another meal. The king is safe, but you know that your survival is only temporary. Your life is a long, slow game of Russian roulette, played with a fork and a spoon. And tomorrow, you will have to do it all over again. The king's body, having been nourished and protected from internal threats, now had to be maintained against the external realities of the medieval world. And that world, even within the stone walls of a castle, was a place of dirt, grime, and ever-present, overpowering smells. The modern image of a filthy, unwashed medieval monarch is largely a caricature, but the royal approach to hygiene was a strange mixture of surprising luxury, practical solutions, and profound superstition. A king did not bathe every day. The daily communal bath of the Romans was a distant, forgotten memory. For a medieval monarch, a full-body bath was a special event, an act of ritual and preparation rather than simple cleaning. It was reserved for occasions like the night before a major feast, a wedding, or a coronation. When a king did bathe, it was an affair of immense luxury. Servants would haul a large wooden tub into his private chambers, line it with clean linen cloths to protect the royal skin from splinters, and then fill it with buckets of hot water, painstakingly heated over a fire, and scent the water with expensive herbs and flowers like chamomile, marjoram, and rose petals. It was a private, indulgent spa treatment, a world away from the daily reality of his subjects. On a day-to-day basis, cleanliness was measured not by bathing, but by linen. The true mark of a nobleman's hygiene was the quality and cleanliness of the fine linen shirt he wore against his skin. This undergarment was changed frequently, sometimes multiple times a day, and was believed to absorb the dirt and sweat of the body, keeping the outer, incredibly expensive garments of silk and velvet clean. The king's laundry was a massive, constant operation, but clean linen could only do so much. To combat the odors of a world without modern sanitation or deodorants, the wealthy relied on a constant barrage of powerful scents. Perfume was not a luxury, it was a necessity. A king's chambers would be filled with the scent of burning incense and fresh herbs strewn across the floor. And his own person was a walking cloud of fragrance. He would wear clothes scented with lavender and carry a pomander, a small ornate metal ball filled with a solid paste of ambergris, musk, and expensive spices. This he would hold to his nose when walking through a crowd or in a stuffy room, creating a personal bubble of pleasant scent to ward off the foul air, which was believed to carry disease. This was the miasma theory in practice. If you could not see the sickness, you could at least smell your way around it. But the king's body was not just something to be cleaned and perfumed. It was believed to be a sacred vessel, an instrument of God's will on earth. And this belief gave rise to one of the most remarkable and bizarre rituals of the medieval age, the royal touch. It was widely believed that a legitimate king, anointed by God at his coronation, possessed the supernatural ability to heal certain diseases simply by touching the afflicted. The primary disease associated with this miracle was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused ugly, swollen abscesses on the lymph nodes of the neck. It was known throughout Europe as the king's evil, precisely because it was believed only the king could cure it. The healing ceremony was a major public and political event. Crowds of sick, desperate, and often disfigured subjects would gather in the castle courtyard. The king, often after taking communion to emphasize his divine connection, would proceed down the line of the afflicted. While a priest chanted prayers, the king would perform the ritual, solemnly laying his hands upon the swollen, oozing sores of each person, one by one. Often, he would also present them with a small touch piece, a coin that had been blessed, which the sufferer would wear around their neck. This practice was one of the most powerful pieces of political propaganda available to a medieval monarch. It was not just about compassion. It was a recurring public demonstration of the king's divine right to rule. If God granted him the power to perform miracles, then surely God had chosen him to be king. It was a way to legitimize his reign, inspire awe and fierce loyalty among his subjects, and visually connect his royal person to the power of the divine. This tradition was practiced for centuries by the kings of both England and France, a powerful fusion of medicine, magic, and political theater. The king's body was therefore both a scented, protected vessel to be guarded from the foulness of the world, and a sacred, healing instrument of God's will. But for all this public performance of divine health, the most private, most human functions of that very same body required a service so intimate and so bizarre, it created the strangest and most powerful position in the entire court. The king's body was a public spectacle, a sacred vessel for healing, and a perfumed symbol of the state. But it was also, of course, a human body, with all of its mundane, undignified, and unavoidable biological functions. And it was in attending to the most private of these functions that the single most bizarre, most misunderstood, and paradoxically most powerful position in the entire royal court was created. We speak of the office of the groom of the king's close stool. The title itself sounds like a joke to our modern ears, but it was a deadly serious and highly coveted role, particularly in the English court of the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. A close stool was, in essence, a portable toilet, a wooden chair often lavishly upholstered in velvet and silk, with a lid that concealed a pewter or ceramic chamber pot below. The primary duty of the groom of the stool was precisely what it sounds like. He was responsible for assisting the king with the entire process of defecation. He would bring the close stool when needed, assist the king, provide water and a linen cloth for cleaning, and then be responsible for the disposal of the contents and the cleaning of the pot. He was, in the simplest terms, the royal toilet attendant. It sounds like the most demeaning and repulsive job in the kingdom. Why, then, was it a position sought after by high-born gentlemen, the sons of knights and nobles? Because the squalor of the duty was completely eclipsed by the incredible power that came with it. The secret was access. In the highly ritualized and public world of the royal court, true privacy was the rarest and most valuable commodity. The king was almost never alone. His bedchamber was a political theater. His dining hall was a public stage. But the moments spent on the close stool were one of the few times he was truly, vulnerably, and privately himself. And the only other person in the room was the groom. In these unguarded moments, free from the prying eyes and ears of ambitious courtiers, the king would speak his mind. The groom of the stool became, by default, the king's most intimate confidant. He heard the king's private fears, his true opinions of his political rivals, his candid thoughts on matters of state, his frustrated complaints about his queen. He was not just cleaning the king's body, he was cleansing the king's mind. He knew more state secrets than any minister, and his loyalty and discretion were paramount. This unrivaled intimacy gave the groom incredible influence. He became the ultimate gatekeeper. While great dukes and powerful bishops had to formally request an audience with the king, the groom of the stool had his ear several times a day. He could choose to pass along a secret message to the king, or choose not to. He could whisper a good word for a friend seeking favor, or a poisonous word against a rival. Powerful nobles would scheme, bribe, and flatter the groom, because they knew that his quiet influence, exerted in the most private of moments, could make or break their careers. Furthermore, the groom of the stool was often in charge of the king's private finances, the privy purse. This was the king's personal budget, separate from the state treasury, which he could use for his own secret projects, to pay spies, or to reward favorites without the oversight of his council. This meant the groom was not just a confidant. He was a powerful financial secretary, managing a secret slush fund for the most powerful man in the kingdom. The men who held this position were not lowly servants. They were gentlemen of good birth, who became some of the most powerful figures in the country. Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool to King Henry VIII, was one of the king's closest friends and a major political player, before he tragically fell from grace and was executed during the turmoil surrounding Anne Boleyn. The irony of the position was absolute. The man performing what was seen as the most menial, unclean, and base task in the entire castle was often cleaner, wealthier, and more powerful than the magnificent, perfumed dukes who waited nervously outside the chamber door. His hands were technically dirty, but they were also firmly on the levers of power. And so, the king's most secret and powerful business was often conducted in his most private chamber, in the presence of the one man who saw him not as a divine monarch, but as a simple, vulnerable human being. But a king's power was not just built on whispers and secrets. It had to be displayed, publicly and magnificently, for all to see. And there was no greater stage for this performance of power than the great royal feast. Having conducted his most secret and influential business in his most private chamber, the king now prepared for his most public performance. For a medieval monarch, the great feast was not about satisfying hunger. It was a carefully orchestrated and hugely expensive piece of political theater, a spectacle designed to awe, intimidate, and project an image of unassailable power and divinely blessed wealth. Imagine you are a visiting noble, invited to a feast in the king's great hall. The room itself is a declaration of power. The ceilings are high, with great smoke-blackened wooden rafters, from which hang magnificent banners bearing the royal coat of arms. The stone walls are covered with rich tapestries depicting heroic hunting scenes or famous battles from the kingdom's history. A massive fireplace, large enough to roast an entire ox, blazes at one end of the room, filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. The floor is strewn with fresh herbs like lavender and meadowsweet, which release a pleasant scent as they are crushed underfoot. A fragrant, but ultimately losing battle against the smell of so many unwashed bodies, greasy food, and the king's hunting dogs that roam freely among the tables. The seating arrangement itself is a rigid, public map of the court's power structure. At the head of the hall, on a raised platform called a dais, sits the high table. Here, the king sits in a great carved chair flanked only by his most important guests, a visiting prince, a powerful duke, the queen, and the archbishop. To be invited to sit at the high table is the ultimate sign of favor. Below, long, rough trestle tables stretch out across the hall, where the lesser nobles and knights are seated. A person's importance could be measured in feet and inches by their proximity to the king. To be seated below the sumpt, a large and ornate salt cellar that marked a symbolic dividing line on the tables, was to be publicly declared a person of lesser status. The maneuvering for a better seat was a source of constant, simmering courtly intrigue. When the food begins to arrive, you realize this is not just a meal, it is a parade. The dishes are brought out in a grand procession, often accompanied by a flourish of trumpets. And the food itself is designed as much for the eyes as for the stomach. This was the age of spectacular, almost surreal presentation. You might see a roasted swan, its meat cooked, but then painstakingly redressed in its own feathers to make it look as if it were still alive, sleeping on a great silver platter. A boar's head might be carried in, its tusks gilded, an apple in its mouth. Between the main courses of meat and game would come the subtleties, or sotelettes. These were elaborate, often inedible, sculptures made from sugar paste, marzipan, or jelly, designed to impress the guests. A subtlety might be a perfect White Castle, a scene from the legend of King Arthur, or a flattering depiction of the king himself slaying a dragon. It was art meant to be admired and then cleared away. While the sheer quantity of food seems staggeringly wasteful, the waste itself was part of the point. A king demonstrated his immense wealth and divine favor by providing far more food than his guests could ever possibly consume. This conspicuous consumption was a political statement, a declaration that his kingdom was prosperous and his resources were limitless. The etiquette of eating was also on display, with a complex set of rules governing who could speak, who was served first, and how one ate, often with fingers and a personal dagger. The leftovers were not always thrown away. They were often distributed to the poor waiting at the castle gates, another act of calculated royal charity. The feast would last for hours, a long, slow pageant of consumption. A carver, a high-ranking servant, would skillfully slice the meat at a side table, his performance a display of grace and precision. The king's cupbearer, another position of great trust, would ensure the royal goblet was never empty, first tasting the wine himself to protect against poison. All the while, the hall would be filled with entertainment. Minstrels would play on lutes and harps from a gallery above. Acrobats and jugglers would perform between the tables, and a constant stream of petitioners, messengers, and favor seekers would try to catch the king's eye. And as the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, a different figure might move through the hall. He was a man dressed in motley clothes, with bells on his hat. He was the only one allowed to interrupt the king, to mock the powerful, and to speak uncomfortable truths. He was the court jester, the fool. As the great feast wears on and the wine flows freely, a new figure emerges from the periphery. He is a man dressed not in the fine velvets of the court, but in a chaotic costume of brightly colored, mismatched patterns, a style known as motley. A floppy cap adorned with ringing bells sits on his head, and in his hand he carries a mock scepter, a bauble, often topped with a miniature grinning carving of his own face. He moves with a strange, unpredictable energy, sometimes leaping, sometimes tumbling, weaving his way between the tables. He is the court jester, the professional fool. And in this rigid, hierarchical world, he is the most paradoxical man in the room. On the surface, his job was simple entertainment. He was there to lighten the mood during the long, often tedious hours of a royal banquet. He would tell bawdy jokes, sing satirical songs, perform acrobatic tricks, and engage in flighting, a type of ritualized insult contest with the nobles, much to the amusement of the king. He was a living spectacle, a man paid to be absurd. But his true role was far more complex and dangerous. The jester's costume was, in effect, a license. By being officially designated as a fool, he was placed outside the normal social hierarchy. And because he was outside the rules of society, he was not bound by its most important rule. You do not criticize the king. Under the guise of madness or idiocy, the jester was often the only person in the entire kingdom who could speak the truth to power without being immediately arrested and executed for treason. The court fool was more than just an entertainer. He was a vital social and political pressure valve. In a rigid world where speaking out of turn could be fatal, the jester provided a safe outlet for criticism and dissent. He could voice the unspoken frustrations of the court or the common people through a clever riddle or a seemingly foolish observation. A powerful duke might be growing too arrogant, and no one would dare to mention it. The jester, however, could compose a silly poem about a peacock who was too proud of its own feathers, making the entire court laugh while delivering a sharp, targeted rebuke that everyone, including the duke, understood. If the king was planning a foolish and expensive war, the ministers might be too afraid to advise against it. The jester, however, could ask a seemingly naive question like, "My lord, if your army is so mighty, will you be bringing all the gold back in one cart or two?" A joke that subtly pointed out the financial folly of the campaign. This was a high-wire act that required incredible intelligence, wit, and a profound understanding of the court's political landscape. The jester had to know exactly how far he could push his jokes. He had to be a master of metaphor, innuendo, and satire. His job was to deliver a bitter pill of truth, coated in a thick layer of honeyed foolishness. A joke that landed well could earn him rewards and increase his influence. A joke that crossed the line from witty to truly insulting could still get him whipped, banished, or worse. He walked a razor's edge between being the king's beloved pet and the king's personal punching bag. Many jesters were not fools at all, but highly intelligent men, sometimes scholars or defrocked priests, who used the jester's cap as a shield. The role often went to those with physical deformities, such as dwarves or hunchbacks, as medieval society often equated physical difference with a connection to the supernatural or a different way of seeing the world. They were seen as natural fools, whose minds were believed to be unburdened by social convention, and therefore capable of seeing a simpler, more honest truth. By allowing himself to be mocked by a fool, the king demonstrated his own wisdom and confidence. It showed that he was a powerful and secure ruler, unafraid of a little criticism. The jester, in turn, acted as a strange sort of royal advisor and therapist, keeping the king's ego in check and reminding a court obsessed with power of the absurdity of its own pretensions. And so, he would move through the great hall, a whirlwind of color and bells and uncomfortable truths. A strange and lonely figure who was at once the lowest-ranking man in the room and, in many ways, the most powerful. But for all the theater of the court, the king had duties that were far more serious than listening to jokes. The most important duty of all was not to the state or to his nobles, but to the future itself, the duty to secure his dynasty. The jester may have spoken of foolish love, but for a king, Love was a luxury he could not afford, and it had almost nothing to do with marriage. A royal marriage was not a union of two hearts. It was the most important diplomatic and political transaction a kingdom could undertake. It was a merger of two realms, a treaty written in flesh and blood, a bargain whose primary purpose was not happiness, but the production of a single all-important commodity, a male heir. The process of arranging a royal marriage was a long, cold, and calculated negotiation. Ambassadors would travel for months between courts, haggling over the terms as if it were a trade deal. The bride's dowry, her lands, her titles, her weight in gold, was a key point of contention. Portraits would be exchanged, so the king and princess could see a flattering, often wildly inaccurate, depiction of the person they were about to be bound to for life. They would often never meet before their wedding day. In many cases, the wedding itself was conducted by proxy. A high-ranking nobleman would stand in for the king at the ceremony in the bride's home country, legally marrying her on his monarch's behalf. Imagine you are that princess, a young woman of 16 perhaps, from the court of Spain. You have just been married in a lavish ceremony to a French duke who is not your husband. Your actual husband, the King of France, is a middle-aged man you have never met, waiting for you hundreds of miles away. You must now leave behind everything you have ever known, your family, your language, your culture, and embark on a long, dangerous journey to a foreign land where you will be a stranger. Your personal feelings are completely irrelevant. You are a political pawn, a vessel for a royal bloodline, and your entire life's purpose has been reduced to a single, terrifying duty. Upon your arrival at your new court, you are the subject of intense scrutiny. You are judged on your beauty, your piety, your command of the language, and above all, your potential fertility. The consummation of the marriage is often a semi-public affair. After the wedding feast, the couple would be ritually escorted to the royal bedchamber by a crowd of high-ranking nobles and ladies. They would be put to bed, the curtains drawn, while the courtiers waited outside for a sign that the marriage had been legitimized. There was no privacy, no intimacy, only the crushing weight of public expectation. And from that moment on, the pressure to produce an heir began. The entire stability of the kingdom rested on what happened in that bedchamber. A king without a son was a king whose dynasty was in peril. His death could trigger a succession crisis, a bloody civil war between rival claimants to the throne. A queen's value was therefore measured almost exclusively by her ability to bear healthy sons. This immense pressure gave rise to a host of strange rituals and superstitions surrounding royal fertility. The queen would be given special diets, she would pray to specific saints, and she would wear sacred relics, all in the hope of conceiving a boy. When she finally became pregnant, the entire court would hold its breath. Astrologers might be consulted to cast a horoscope for the unborn child, predicting its destiny. The queen is now the most important vessel in the state, but she is also more of a prisoner than ever before. The birth itself was the final, terrifying ordeal. A royal birth was a public event, at least for a select audience. The birthing chamber was a purely female space, but it was crowded. You would be attended not just by midwives, but by the highest-ranking ladies of the court, the queen mother, your own ladies-in-waiting, the wives of powerful dukes. They were not all there for comfort. They were there as official witnesses, to ensure that the baby was indeed born of your body and that no secret swap could be made. In an age of disputed successions, the legitimacy of the birth had to be beyond question. In an era before modern medicine, childbirth was perilous for any woman. But for a queen, it was a public trial fraught with immense pressure. A successful birth, that produced a healthy male heir, secured the dynasty, and solidified your own position and power. A stillbirth, or the birth of another daughter, however, was seen as a personal and political failure. The queen's inability to produce a son could lead to her being divorced and cast aside, as famously happened to Catherine of Aragon, or even executed on trumped-up charges like Anne Boleyn. The queen's life and the stability of the entire kingdom literally depended on the outcome of this dangerous, painful event. Imagine the moment the child is born. The room is silent, waiting. The midwife lifts the baby. She inspects it, and then she makes the announcement that will seal your fate. If she cries, "It is a princess," there is a polite but palpable wave of disappointment. You have done your duty, but only partially. The pressure will begin all over again. But if she cries, "It is a prince," the entire court, the entire kingdom, erupts in celebration. Bells would ring across the land. Great feasts are declared. The dynasty is secure, for now. You have fulfilled your ultimate purpose. You have not just given birth to your child. You have given birth to a king. And in doing so, you have finally secured your own fragile place in this dangerous world. A king's power over the beasts of the forest was a symbol of his greater power over the men of his kingdom. He was not just a warrior and a landlord. He was the fountain of all justice, a figure appointed by God to maintain order in a violent and often chaotic world. To come before the king in his court was to come before the law itself, and the justice dispensed there was often as strange and as brutal as the world it governed. Imagine you are Thomas, our young nobleman, standing in the great hall of a castle. The king is holding court. He sits upon his great, carved throne, elevated on a dais, his most trusted advisors beside him. Before him is a procession of his subjects, from high-ranking barons with disputes over land, to humble peasants seeking redress for a stolen pig. For many, this is their only chance to have their case heard by the ultimate authority. But this is not a world of lawyers, of evidence, of cross-examination in the modern sense. This is a world where justice is personal, and where proof is often sought not from witnesses, but directly from God himself. When a case could not be decided by simple testimony, when one man's oath was pitted against another's, the court would often turn to a set of deeply superstitious and terrifying practices known as a trial by ordeal. The logic behind the ordeal was simple. An accused person would be subjected to a dangerous and painful test, and it was believed that God would intervene with a miracle to protect the innocent. One of the most common was the ordeal by fire. You might watch as a man accused of theft is forced to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a set distance of 9 feet. His burned hand is then immediately bandaged and sealed with the court's wax seal. 3 days later, he is brought back before the court and the bandage is removed. If the wound is healing cleanly, it is a sign that God has declared him innocent. If it has become infected and festered, it is a sign of his guilt, and he is taken to be punished, often by hanging. Another common method was the ordeal by cold water. An accused woman, perhaps a suspected adulteress or witch, would be bound hand and foot and thrown into a river or a deep pool that had been blessed by a priest. Since water was a pure element, it was believed that it would reject an impure, guilty person. Therefore, if she floated to the surface, she was declared guilty. If she sank, she was considered innocent, as the pure water had accepted her. She would, of course, have to be pulled out quickly to prevent her from drowning. But this was a secondary concern to the divine verdict. A king's role in these proceedings was crucial. He was not just a referee, he was the divine conduit. His presence sanctified the verdict. By presiding over these trials, the king reinforced the idea that his justice and God's justice were one and the same. It was a powerful way to maintain social order, not through a complex legal code, but through a shared belief in divine judgment and the king's sacred authority. For the nobility, there was a different, more honorable way to settle disputes: trial by combat. You might witness two knights who have a bitter feud over a piece of land stand before the king. After swearing sacred oaths on holy relics that their cause is just, they would don their armor and fight. It was not a tournament joust with blunted lances. It was a deadly duel, often to the death. It was believed that God would not allow a righteous man to be defeated, and so he would grant strength to the arm of the man who was in the right. The victor did not just win the fight, he won the lawsuit. The king would preside over this, his presence ensuring it was a sacred act of justice and not just a common brawl. As you stand in the great hall and watch two armored men brutally hack at each other to decide the ownership of a small stream, you realize the nature of power in this world. It is direct, it is physical, and it is cloaked in the language of divine will. There is no appeal. The king's court has spoken, and it is believed that his verdict is a reflection of God's own. And so the king's judgment, seen as God's judgment, decided the fate of men, their lands, and their lives. But there was another area where his will was just as absolute, and where the stakes were not just for an individual, but for the entire dynasty: the world of royal marriage. With the succession secured, the king could turn his full attention to the other primary function of his rule: dispensing God's justice upon the land. The king's power over the beasts of the forest was a symbol of his greater power over the men of his kingdom. He was not just a warrior and a landlord. He was the fountain of all justice, a figure appointed by God to maintain order in a violent and often chaotic world. To come before the king in his court was to come before the law itself, and the justice dispensed there was often as strange and as brutal as the world it governed. Imagine you are Thomas, our young nobleman, standing in the great hall of a castle. The king is holding court. He sits upon his great carved throne, elevated on a dais, his most trusted advisors beside him. Before him is a procession of his subjects, from high-ranking barons with disputes over land to humble peasants seeking redress for a stolen pig. For many, this is their only chance to have their case heard by the ultimate authority. But this is not a world of lawyers, of evidence, of cross-examination in the modern sense. This is a world where justice is personal, and where proof is often sought, not from witnesses, but directly from God himself. When a case could not be decided by simple testimony, when one man's oath was pitted against another's, the court would often turn to a set of deeply superstitious and terrifying practices known as a trial by ordeal. The logic behind the ordeal was simple. An accused person would be subjected to a dangerous and painful test, and it was believed that God would intervene with a miracle to protect the innocent. One of the most common was the ordeal by fire. You might watch as a man accused of theft is forced to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a set distance of 9 feet. His burned hand is then immediately bandaged and sealed with the court's wax seal. 3 days later, he is brought back before the court and the bandage is removed. If the wound is healing cleanly, it is a sign that God has declared him innocent. If it has become infected and festered, it is a sign of his guilt, and he is taken to be punished, often by hanging. Another common method was the ordeal by cold water. An accused woman, perhaps a suspected adulteress or witch, would be bound hand and foot and thrown into a river or a deep pool that had been blessed by a priest. Since water was a pure element, it was believed that it would reject an impure, guilty person. Therefore, if she floated to the surface, she was declared guilty. If she sank, she was considered innocent, as the pure water had accepted her. She would, of course, have to be pulled out quickly to prevent her from drowning, but this was a secondary concern to the divine verdict. A king's role in these proceedings was crucial. He was not just a referee, he was the divine conduit. His presence sanctified the verdict. By presiding over these trials, the king reinforced the idea that his justice and God's justice were one and the same. It was a powerful way to maintain social order, not through a complex legal code, but through a shared belief in divine judgment and the king's sacred authority. For the nobility, there was a different, more honorable way to settle disputes: trial by combat. You might witness two knights who have a bitter feud over a piece of land stand before the king. After swearing sacred oaths on holy relics that their cause is just, they would don their armor and fight. It was not a tournament joust with blunted lances. It was a deadly duel, often to the death. It was believed that God would not allow a righteous man to be defeated. And so he would grant strength to the arm of the man who was in the right. The victor did not just win the fight, he won the lawsuit. The king would preside over this, his presence ensuring it was a sacred act of justice and not just a common brawl. As you stand in the great hall and watch two armored men brutally hack at each other to decide the ownership of a small stream, you realize the nature of power in this world. It is direct, it is physical, and it is cloaked in the language of divine will. There is no appeal. The king's court has spoken, and it is believed that his verdict is a reflection of God's own. With the succession secured and the court at peace, one might imagine the king residing permanently in his grand capital city. But the reality for many medieval monarchs was a life of constant motion. The court did not stay in one place. It was a traveling circus of power, and this was known as the royal progress. The first and most practical reason for the progress was filth. A medieval castle or palace, for all its tapestries and grandeur, was a sanitation nightmare. With hundreds, sometimes thousands, of courtiers, servants, soldiers, and animals, all living in close quarters, the waste produced was immense. The garderobes, the castle toilets, were little more than stone chutes that emptied into a moat or a cesspit at the base of the walls. After a few months of continuous occupation, the stench would become unbearable. The water sources would be contaminated, and the risk of disease would skyrocket. The court had to move on, in part, simply to let the castle air out, and allow an army of servants to perform a deep, arduous cleaning. The second reason was economics. It was often far easier and cheaper to move the court to the food than to move all the food to the court. The king would travel on a great circuit between his various royal manors and estates scattered throughout the kingdom. Upon arriving at a new castle, the entire court would essentially live off the local economy, consuming the grain from its storehouses, the cattle from its fields, and the wine from its cellars. It was a form of tax collection in kind, a great hungry caterpillar eating its way across the landscape. For the local lord or village that had to host the king, a royal visit was a tremendous honor. But it was also a catastrophic financial burden that could take years to recover from. But the most important reason for the progress was politics. A king had to be seen by his subjects. His physical presence was a projection of power. By traveling through his realm, he could remind his powerful, often rebellious, regional nobles exactly who was in charge. He would hold court in their castles, dispense justice to the local populace, and receive oaths of fealty, all while his own army of knights and retainers was billeted in their lands. It was a charming, friendly visit with a clear, unspoken threat. Remember who I am. This is my kingdom. Imagine you are a simple carter, hired to transport just one wagon in this colossal procession. The royal progress is a river of humanity miles long. At its head are the knights and men-at-arms, a show of military might. Then comes the king and his personal retinue, followed by the queen and her ladies-in-waiting, often riding in ornate, uncomfortable wagons. Behind them stretches a seemingly endless baggage train. This was the entire government on the move. There were wagons filled with the king's personal furniture, including his bed, which was dismantled and reassembled at every stop. There were wagons for the royal wardrobe, for the kitchen supplies with its pots and pans, for the barrels of wine. There were wagons carrying the sacred relics of the royal chapel, and even wagons carrying the rolls of parchment and chests of coin that constituted the kingdom's treasury and archives. The journey was incredibly slow, moving at the pace of the most heavily laden wagon, perhaps only 10 or 12 miles on a good day. The roads were often little more than muddy tracks. Wagons would get stuck, wheels would break, and the entire procession would grind to a halt. It was a logistical nightmare. After weeks on the road, the great procession finally arrives at its destination, a new castle in a new corner of the kingdom. The king has brought his power and his presence to his people. For the next few months, this will be the center of the universe. But this life of constant travel, of sleeping in different beds, of eating different food and drinking different water, carried with it its own set of risks. And what happened when the king, this divine figure, the very embodiment of the nation, fell ill in a world without modern medicine? The king's body was an object of immense political significance, a symbol of the health and stability of the entire realm. Therefore, when a king fell ill, it was not a private family matter. It was a crisis of state. The finest physicians in the kingdom would be summoned, and the royal body would be subjected to the most intense, expensive, and often the most bizarre and dangerous medical treatments the age had to offer. Imagine you are a courtier, standing vigil in the king's sick room. The air is thick with the cloying smell of incense, burning herbs, and strange medicinal poultices. The king lies in his great bed, his breath shallow, his skin slick with a feverish sweat. A team of royal physicians, learned men in dark robes, huddle in a corner, their voices low and urgent. They are not discussing viruses or bacteria. They are discussing the king's humors. Medieval medicine was built entirely on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. It was believed that the human body was composed of four liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four humors in perfect balance. An illness, any illness, from a common cold to the plague, was seen as an imbalance of these humors. A fever, for instance, was a sign of an excess of hot and wet blood. The entire goal of a medieval doctor was not to kill a pathogen, but to rebalance these vital fluids. The primary tool for this was bloodletting. You watch as the king's physician, after a long consultation, nods gravely. A surgeon approaches the royal bed with a small, sharp lancet. He makes a neat incision in the king's arm, and a stream of dark blood flows into a silver basin. They will drain a specific amount, believing that by removing the excess blood, they are cooling the king's fever and restoring his balance. In reality, of course, they are fatally weakening an already sick man, draining his body of the very substance it needs to fight the infection. If bloodletting was not deemed appropriate, the other option was purging. The king might be given powerful emetics, substances designed to induce violent vomiting, or strong laxatives to cleanse his body of the bad humors that were believed to be causing the sickness. But these treatments were never administered randomly. Their timing was governed by another, even more powerful science: astrology. The royal physician would not dare make an incision or prescribe a purge without first consulting a complex astrological chart. The position of the planets, the phase of the moon, and the king's own zodiac sign were all believed to influence which humors were dominant at any given time. A treatment performed under the wrong celestial alignment was believed to be ineffective or even fatal. The doctor was as much an astrologer as he was a physician, his medical decisions guided by the movements of the heavens. The medicines themselves were a strange and expensive pharmacopoeia. While some were based on legitimate herbal remedies, many were a testament to the power of superstition. A king's potion might contain not just herbs, but exotic ingredients from the far corners of the known world. The most sought after of these was mummia, or mummy powder. This was a powder made from the ground-up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies, which were looted from their tombs and sold at incredible prices across Europe. It was believed that the bitumen and resins used in the mummification process held powerful healing properties. Powdered precious stones were also a common ingredient. A king might be given a tonic containing crushed emeralds to fight dysentery, or pearls dissolved in wine to strengthen his heart. Even gold was considered a powerful medicine. A wealthy patient might be given a cordial containing flecks of gold leaf, based on the principle of sympathetic magic. To ingest the most perfect and incorruptible substance on earth was to bring that same perfection and incorruptibility into your own body. You stand in a sick room, watching this strange and desperate theater unfold. You see the physicians consulting their star charts. You see the servants grinding precious gems into a fine powder. You see the priest praying in a corner. You are witnessing the pinnacle of medical science for your time. A desperate combination of ancient fury, arcane superstition, and blind hope. And as you look at the pale, sweating face of your king, you know that despite all this knowledge, all this wealth, his chances of survival are likely no better than those of the humblest peasant in his kingdom. For all the astrological charts, all the powdered gems, and all the prayers, there was often only one outcome. The king's illness worsens. His breathing becomes shallow. The physicians step back, their work done, their remedies failed. For all the astrological charts, all the powdered gems, and all the prayers, there was often only one outcome. The king's illness worsens. His breathing becomes shallow. The physicians step back from the bed, their work done. Their expensive and useless remedies failed. They have lost the battle. The king is dying, and the final, most crucial, and most bizarrely public performance of his life is about to begin. A king's death, like his life, was not a private affair. As the end drew near, the royal bedchamber, which had been a place of hushed medical anxiety, would transform into a crowded political stage. The most powerful figures of the realm would be summoned to bear witness. Imagine you are Thomas, our young courtier, allowed back into the room for this solemn, final event. You stand in the corner, trying to make yourself invisible. The room is packed with the great nobles of the kingdom, the king's eldest son and heir, his powerful brothers, the Lord Chancellor, the Treasurer, and the Archbishop, all gathered in a silent, tense vigil around the royal deathbed. They were not there simply to offer comfort or to say their goodbyes. They were there as official witnesses. Their presence was essential to ensure the stability of the kingdom. They had to see the king draw his last breath with their own eyes. This was to prevent any possibility of a rumor spreading that the king was not truly dead or had been murdered in secret. It also prevented a pretender from appearing later, claiming to be the king who had miraculously recovered. The death of the monarch had to be an undeniable public fact, witnessed and ratified by all the key players of the realm. The archbishop steps forward. In the quiet of the room, he performs the last rites of the church. He anoints the king with holy oil and gives him the final communion, the viaticum, food for his soul's journey into the next world. This was a vital moment, a public confirmation that the king was dying as a good Christian. His soul prepared to meet its maker. The king's family might be brought in for a final stilted farewell, their personal grief playing out under the watchful eyes of the court. Then there is only the waiting. The room is silent, save for the king's labored, rattling breaths and the low murmur of the archbishop's prayers. Finally, the moment comes. The king draws one last, shuddering breath. And then there is silence. He is gone. What happens next is a swift and stunning piece of political theater. There is no great outpouring of grief from the assembled nobles. That will come later, in its own ritualized form. The immediate priority is the seamless transfer of power. The Lord Chancellor might step forward, formally take the great signet ring from the dead king's finger, and present it to the heir. Then, a herald or a high-ranking nobleman would make the famous, paradoxical cry that ensured the kingdom was never without a head. The king is dead. Long live the king. And in that instant, every single person in the room, including the dead king's own brothers, would turn, kneel, and swear their allegiance to the new monarch, the young man who a moment ago was only a prince. The power has been transferred instantly and unequivocally. The body on the bed is no longer a king, it is a corpse. The true king is the man now standing beside it. This ritual was the kingdom's greatest defense against the chaos of a disputed succession and the bloody civil war that could follow. The story of the royal body, however, was not over. It would not be left in peace. It was immediately handed over to the royal surgeons and embalmers. The process was a grim necessity, especially if the king had died far from his intended burial place. It involved the removal of the internal organs, the heart, brain, and entrails, which were often preserved separately in spiced wine and placed in their own caskets. It was not uncommon for a king's body to be buried in one great cathedral, his heart in another, and his entrails in a third, spreading his holy remains across his kingdom. The body cavity would then be stuffed with salt and sweet-smelling herbs before being sewn up and tightly wrapped in waxed linen to preserve it for the long period of lying in state and the final grand funeral procession. The old king lies in state, a silent, perfumed effigy of his former self. But the machinery of the dynasty has already moved on. The focus of the entire court, all its ambitions and its fears, is now fixed entirely on the new king and the legacy he will build. We have seen the king as a ruler, a husband, a judge, and a patient. But every king, no matter how powerful, was once a child. And to be a royal child in the Middle Ages was not a life of fairy tales and playful abandon. It was the beginning of a long, often lonely, and intensely demanding apprenticeship in power. It was a life lived inside a gilded cage. Imagine you are 7 years old. You are not a boy. You are a prince, the heir to the throne. You do not have a playroom. You have a separate royal household, a staff of dozens dedicated to your care, your education, and your ever-present security. You do not wake when you wish. You wake when your chamberlain tells you it is time. You do not choose your clothes. They are chosen for you. Magnificent and restrictive garments of velvet and silk that are miniature versions of your father's own. You are dressed not for comfort or play, but for display. You are a living symbol of the dynasty's future. Your childhood is a world of profound isolation. You do not play freely with the children of the village or even the children of the castle staff. Your companions are carefully selected sons of the highest-ranking nobility, boys who are your friends, but also your future subjects and potential rivals. Every game you play is watched. Every word you speak is noted. There is no room for the normal, messy, and uninhibited behavior of childhood. A common boy might have a tantrum. A prince who shows excessive anger is displaying a worrying lack of the temperate, balanced humors required of a future king. A common boy might cry when he falls. A prince is expected to endure pain with a stoicism far beyond his years. Let us first consider the queen consort, the king's wife. Her most direct route to power was through her influence over the king himself. In the private moments of the royal bedchamber, away from the posturing of the council, she had the king's ear. A beloved or respected wife could become his most trusted advisor, a confidant with whom he could share his true fears and ambitions. She could use this intimacy to advocate for her own interests, often promoting the political fortunes of her own family from her home country, or securing powerful positions for her favored courtiers and ladies in waiting. To be a friend of the queen was to have a direct line to the king's heart. Queens were also major cultural patrons. While the king funded wars and castles, the queen often shaped the cultural tone of the court. She would commission tapestries, support poets and minstrels, and cultivate a refined atmosphere of art and music. Her piety was also a powerful tool. By founding convents, donating lavishly to churches, and performing public acts of charity, a queen could win the devotion of the common people and the powerful support of the church, building her own independent power base, one rooted in faith and popular affection. A queen's influence grew even greater if her husband died and her son ascended the throne. As the queen mother, she was no longer just a wife, but the respected matriarch of the ruling dynasty. Her political experience was invaluable to her young, often inexperienced son. She knew the treacherous nobles, she understood the complex family alliances, and she could guide him through the early years of his reign. Her position was secure, and she could often speak with a frankness that other advisors would not dare. But the ultimate expression of female power came when a king died while his son and heir was still a child. In this scenario, the queen mother was often named queen regent, ruling the entire kingdom in her son's name until he came of age. This was the pinnacle of female authority in the medieval world. These women were not just stand-ins, they were rulers. They led armies, conducted diplomacy, managed the treasury, and ruthlessly crushed their political opponents. History is filled with these formidable queen regents. Blanche of Castile, mother of the future Saint Louis IX of France, ruled the kingdom with an iron fist after her husband's death. She successfully put down a massive rebellion by the French barons, personally leading armies and outmaneuvering her enemies with brilliant political skill, securing the throne for her young son. In England, Isabella of France, the wife of the weak King Edward II, took an even more direct route. Unhappy with her husband and his powerful favorites, she allied with an exiled nobleman, raised an army, invaded her own husband's kingdom, and overthrew him, ruling as regent for her son Edward III. And perhaps most famously, there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the entire Middle Ages. She was queen consort of both France and England at different times, and as queen mother, she effectively ruled the vast Angevin Empire while her son, Richard the Lionhide, was away on crusade, and later when he was captured and held for ransom. She managed a kingdom, raised an enormous ransom, and navigated complex rebellions, proving herself to be a more capable ruler than many of the kings of her time. These powerful women demonstrated that while the path to power for a medieval woman was narrow and often depended on her relationship to a man, as a wife or a mother, once she attained that power, she could be every bit as cunning, capable, and ruthless as any king. They were masters of a different kind of power game, one played with influence, piety, and an unshakable determination to protect the legacy of their sons. And so, the court was a complex web of power, a constant dance of influence between the king, his queen, his spies, and his nobles. But all of this, the wars, the feasts, the castles, the intrigue, rested on a single vital foundation: the royal treasury. The court was a complex web of power, a constant dance of influence between the king, his queen, his spies, and his nobles. But all of this, the wars, the feasts, the magnificent castles, the political intrigue, rested on a single foundation, vital foundation: the royal treasury. A king could have the noblest bloodline and the grandest titles, but without a constant flow of cold, hard cash and valuable goods, he was a powerless figurehead. The constant, often desperate, struggle for money was the secret obsession that drove the decisions of every medieval monarch. So where did a king's wealth actually come from? Unlike a modern government with a complex tax system, a medieval king had several distinct, and often unreliable, sources of income. His primary source of wealth was from his own personal lands. The king was by far the largest landowner in the realm, and the royal demesne, a collection of manors, forests, and towns that belonged directly to the crown, generated a steady income from rents, feudal dues, and the sale of agricultural produce, like wool and grain. The second source was the feudal system itself. The great nobles of the realm held their land from the king, and in return, they owed him specific obligations. The most important was military service, but nobles could often pay a fee, known as scutage, to be exempted from a particular campaign. The king also had the right to a hefty inheritance tax when a nobleman died and his heir took over his lands. He controlled the marriages of wealthy heiresses and widows, and could essentially sell their hand to the highest bidder. He could also claim the income from a noble's estate while their heir was still a minor. It was a complex system of rights and obligations that ensured a steady trickle of wealth flowed from the nobility up to the crown. Justice was also a business. The king's courts generated significant income: fines for breaking the law, fees paid by nobles for royal charters granting them special privileges, and, most lucratively of all, the confiscation of all lands and property from a nobleman convicted of treason were all vital streams of revenue. Regular, kingdom-wide taxes, as we know them, were rare and deeply unpopular. They were usually only levied for specific, extraordinary reasons that were seen as benefiting the entire realm, like funding a crusade, defending against an invasion, or, most famously, raising the enormous ransom for a captured king, as was the case with Richard the Lionheart. To impose a new tax without a good reason was one of the quickest ways for a king to incite a perennial revolt. And a king needed every coin he could get because his expenses were colossal. By far the biggest drain on the treasury was warfare. Paying for mercenary soldiers, building and maintaining castles, commissioning expensive siege engines, and funding long campaigns in foreign lands could bankrupt even the wealthiest kingdom. The second major expense was the court itself. The lavish lifestyle was politically necessary. The great feasts, the fine clothes of velvet and silk, be expensive gifts given to visiting dignitaries and loyal nobles. All of this was part of the performance of power, a projection of wealth and stability. But it was ruinously expensive. Unlike a modern government, a medieval king often had no clear distinction between his personal wealth and the state's treasury. The kingdom's finances were, in essence, his own household finances. This led to a constant struggle. Many of Europe's most powerful kings were perpetually in debt, often to great Italian banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, or to Jewish moneylenders who, unlike Christians, were not forbidden by the church from charging interest. The constant need for money was the primary driver of political conflict between the king and his powerful barons, a struggle that eventually led to the creation of institutions like the English Parliament. which was born from the desire of the nobles to control the king's ability to raise taxes for his wars. And so you must imagine the king not just as a warrior or a judge, but as a kind of medieval CEO, constantly balancing an unstable budget. He sat at the center of a vast, complex, and often inefficient economic machine, a world where his divine right to rule meant little if he could not afford to pay his soldiers. We have now journeyed through the strange and often contradictory daily life of a medieval monarch. We have witnessed the public ritual of his awakening, the paranoid ceremony of his dinner table, the divine performance of his healing touch, and the secret power of his privy chamber. We have seen a life of immense luxury and crippling superstition, of absolute power and profound personal fragility. To our modern eyes, these habits seem absurd, irrational, and at times utterly insane. But they were not born from madness. They were the logical and often necessary solutions to the unique and crushing pressures of medieval kingship. To understand these bizarre habits, we must understand the world that created them. It was a world defined by three constant, overwhelming pressures: the need to project legitimate power, the constant threat of death, and the absolute duty to preserve the dynasty. Every strange ritual we have explored was a carefully constructed defense against one of these pressures. First, consider the pressure of power and legitimacy. In an age before mass media, a king's power was not abstract. It had to be made real and visible every single day. The king's body was the state. This is why his life could not be private. The lever, the formal ceremony of waking and dressing, was not about vanity. It was a daily, ritualized performance that reinforced the entire court hierarchy. The royal touch was not a medical procedure. It was a powerful act of political propaganda, a recurring public miracle that proved to the common people that their king was not just a man, but God's chosen representative on earth. The great feasts and the royal hunts were not mere leisure. They were a theater of wealth and martial prowess, a declaration that the king was powerful enough to tame both nature and his kingdom. Next, consider the pressure of constant mortal danger. The fear of poison was not paranoia. It was a rational response to a very real threat. Poison was the silent, effective weapon of choice for political rivals, and the elaborate security of the food taster was the medieval equivalent of the Secret Service. The royal progress, the strange habit of moving the entire court from castle to castle, was driven by the very real danger of disease. In a world without sanitation, a castle would literally become a death trap of filth and sickness after a few months. Moving the court was the only way to survive. Even the strange medical cures, the bloodletting and the powdered gems, were a logical application of the best, albeit deeply flawed, scientific knowledge they had at their disposal. Finally, there was the ultimate pressure of dynasty. The bizarre, public, and often cruel rituals surrounding royal marriage and childbirth were born from a single terrifying reality. A kingdom without a clear, legitimate male heir was a kingdom doomed to civil war. The stability of the entire nation rested on the queen's ability to produce a son. Therefore, her fertility and the birth itself could not be private matters. They were events of national security. The public bedding ceremonies and the official witnesses at the birth were legal and political necessities designed to create an undeniable public truth that would safeguard the realm from the bloodshed of a succession crisis. And so, when we look back at these strange habits, we see a pattern. They were all tools. They were the armor that a king wore against a dangerous and uncertain world. They were the rituals that gave meaning, order, and a sense of divine sanction to a life of immense power, but also of immense fragility. The king was the loneliest man in his kingdom, surrounded by people, but trusting no one. his every action, from the dinner table to the privy, a matter of national security. The madness, in its own way, had a perfect and often brutal logic. The king's life, which seemed so extraordinary, was in fact a rigid performance, dictated not by personal whim, but by the relentless pressures of his position. And in that, we see a timeless truth, that the more power a person wields, the more they become a servant to the very power they are trying to protect. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the strange and often misunderstood world of the medieval court. It's a powerful reminder that the lives of the powerful were often just as bizarre and constrained as the lives of the poor, simply in different, more luxurious ways. If you enjoy these deep dives that peel back the layers of history to reveal the complex human realities beneath, please take a moment to support the channel. Leaving a like on the video is the best way to help these stories reach more people. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration into the past. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Which of the bizarre royal habits did you find the most fascinating? The intimate power of the groom of the stool, the divine healing of the royal touch, or the constant, paranoid fear of poison at every meal? Thank you again for your time. Until our next journey to the past, sleep well.